Welcome to Crucial Conversations from the Rialto Center for the Arts. I'm Doug Blackmon, and over the next 90 minutes, we're going to be discussing law enforcement, students, citizens, and the debate over police practices that has gripped our nation in 2020. Our guests today are George Greenidge, a Ph.D. student at Race and Urban Studies at Georgia State, who already holds a bachelor's degree from Morehouse University, a master's of education from Harvard, and who's been an active participant and organizer around race, class, and gender issues here, beginning long before the most recent demonstrations in Atlanta. Joe Spillane is the chief of the Georgia State University Police Department. He's been in that job for 4 years, but before that, worked for almost 30 years for the Atlanta Police Department, where he rose to the rank of deputy chief and ultimately oversaw all police operations in the city of Atlanta. Aliyah Jones is a senior studying managerial science and minoring in public policy, a native of Columbus, Ohio. Since arriving at Georgia State, she's been deeply involved in student activism, joining and becoming a community organizer for the Malcolm X grassroots movement. She's the interim vice president of the second chapter of the Black Power Book Club, which she established at GSU in the spring of 2019. Through both organizations, Aliyah was a co-founder of the African Diaspora Student Advocacy Coalition, a group of student organizations that have been vocal advocates for changes in policing during the Black Lives Matter protests in Atlanta. I want to emphasize just how pleased we are that all three of you were willing to participate in a program like this. A lot of people, I think, would say there's no way that a police chief would be willing to sit down on camera with a couple of people who've been very involved in organizing student protests having to do with police practices at a time when it'd be reasonable for you to expect that they would be frustrated or angry or hostile. You know, I think it's really commendable that you're willing to do that, and I think it's a testament to all three of you that your willingness to sit down and have a conversation like this. This both about the concerns and anxieties that people have, but that is also ultimately about trying to figure out where we should be going or how we might end up in a different place eventually. In the context of that, Chief Spillane, we'll talk about some specific things that you have proposed in terms of the department that you run now. I mean, this has been a period of most of a year in which police practices have been the center of such debate and criticism of police officers, whether they were specifically accused of doing bad things or not, but just it's been a bad time, a bad environment, I would imagine, to be a police officer. But where are you now on all of this?
Well, you know, of course, we started this year pretty well, and then we got into the COVID, and then in May we had the George Floyd incident. So it kind of woke us all up a little bit. And I think, you know, you speak about a police chief, you know, not wanting to have these crucial conversations, but the fact is that we've got to have them. Because if we're going to move from where we are to where we should be as a nation, we've got to have these conversations. And sometimes they're a little bit painful, but we all in policing have to evolve some and have to understand where people's frustrations are coming from. And when you watch that George Floyd video, I got to tell you, it's a disturbing video to watch. The day after that video, I made all of my officers watch it. I made them all take a 2-hour course on agonal breathing and the causes of it and how to revive somebody from it. And I made them all take another course from Georgia Post on in-custody deaths and how to prevent them. So I started out there, and I've grown from there. And actually working in Georgia State's been wonderful because I've had the benefit of all of the different chairs and deans. I've been on the task force, the president's task force on racial equality, and I've gotten a lot of perspective, and I've had some deep thoughts myself about the profession I'm in and how we can make it better, where we're more ambassadors to our communities than we are guardians or warriors.
Aliyah, so, you know, that's a promising point of view, I think, to hear from any police chief, you know, that sort of openness to change. But how does it strike you as an undergraduate and somebody who's been really close to the protests and some specific demands that have been made to the university, some of it specifically about Chief Spillane's department. But what's your initial reaction to that kind of a response from the chief?
I think that's a really good response. It was taken seriously because we're dealing with extrajudicial killings, you know, like you acted as the jury, the judge, and the executioner. So I really like that response, because even I look back at like the Watts riots and like the one after Rodney King, it's like, where was the response at? How are we even here today after you had those type of riots like that? So I really like that response. I do want to see like the long-term goal about that. And I hope you would speak more about what's like, more so the long-term goal. I know we've seen Georgia State released their action plan, and it was just basically saying we're going to look at their protocols and policies, things like that. Then we'll consider a advisory board, but even I question the advisory board and why is it just a consideration? I know with ADSAC, African Diaspora Student Advocacy Coalition, we're like, hey, security infrastructure, into the Gilly program, security infrastructure, also just creating a culture around where it's on everyone to be like, to end violence on campus first and foremost, and harassment, things like that, where the police don't even have to get called. So look at those prevention actions that we can do as a community rather than putting it on the police. So even that goes back to even the infrastructure, anything that could prevent, you know what I'm saying, police getting involved and things like that. Then we would look at the Cultural Diversity Committee. I mean, you've seen their letters, right? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So they sent out stuff that I was like, oh, like that makes sense. And I know when we sent our demands, ADSAC, we were like, go ahead and throw this on top of our demands too. I know the sociology had their own as well. So that's what we're looking forward to. And they're basically saying the same rhetoric, like reallocate GSUPD funding for these services, demilitarizing the GSUPD and things like that. So I think it's a good start. I'm glad. I think that hopefully shows like your long-term intentions, but that was way better than what I feel like GSU put out with that action plan, where they're like, we're just gonna look at the policies and this and that. And we'll consider an advisory board. I would say elected official control board, because they didn't really go in depth what that even meant. So
well, I can tell you that the advisory board idea actually came from a couple of members of the task force, and I was one of them. And my suggestion was an advisory board be formed and provided some training in legal, in the law, in what we're allowed to do as police officers and what we're not allowed to do, but take away that authority from me and give it to the board. And I'm not involved in the board. I go answer questions to the board. I show them body cameras. I tell them legally why I took action I took, but ultimately put some power in the hands of the faculty, staff, students to say, hey, this is not how, as a community, we want to be policed. Because part of policing is to have buy-in from the community. So you can't really have that buy-in from the community if you're not working with them. So a lot of police chiefs fear independent advisory boards where they can be overruled on decisions like firing, terminating an officer. But that's what the courts are for, and that's what civil service is for. And so if an advisory board decides to take an action against an officer, if that action is not just, I would be speaking at a civil service hearing, or I would be speaking in court as to why my decisions were what they were, and may have gone against what the advisory board wants to do. But it does show transparency. So we are actually going to implement an advisory board. The suggestion was made, I accept it, and we're working on just how that would work at the university. The city of Atlanta has a civilian review board that cannot override the chief, though. And so the chief still is the final authority on discipline for police officers in the city. I don't want to be the final authority on that if someone complains to the advisory board that I'm not being fair and I'm not disciplining officers correctly, because you just don't want that. You want transparency to the community and legitimacy with the community. And that's part of the 21st century policing document that President Obama presented back in 2015. Police legitimacy was a big part of the pillars in building that legitimacy in the community, and you can't have it without transparency.
George, what do your role in this environment is a little different from Aliyah's. You're a little older. You've got, you've been to school a lot already.
Worked in government. Yeah.
Worked in government, and your role in the community of Georgia State is a little bit more of a convener. Yeah, sort of connecting people together, but also with a real sensibility about what the concerns of students are and the community in a lot of ways. But the one thing that strikes me about just the conversation so far is that these are all really good ideas, and it's hard to say. It'd be hard for Aliyah to say those are bad ideas coming from the chief, but it seems like one of the things that's different about this year and the debate right now is that something about these most recent events sort of pushed pushed America to a level of a loss of confidence in police that makes it harder to talk about specific incremental improvements. But what do you make of this?
I think I'm really glad to be here. I think we really have to take a longer kind of historical look about the relationship with the police, and we can particularly look at the city of Atlanta. You hear students talk about their relationships with the police because their grandmother and their grandfather told them about these relationships. Students here in Atlanta have parents and grandparents that had very strong adversarial relationships with the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. And so these stories are real stories that are actually passed down by generation and generation. And so when things like COVID and things like unemployment and things like people not going to work and tragedy of things of what happened to George Floyd happens, those are a confluence of many different things that have landed into our lap here in the city of Atlanta and also downtown Atlanta with the discussions that we're talking about race and policing and all these different things that are happening right now in our communities. But I think the main thing is that we have to look at what Atlanta wants to be and wants to stand up to be. We have these many long things of the historical Atlanta, respectable politics, all of these different things. But Atlanta is very different now from it's 2020. Georgia State is very different than it was 15 years ago. Right now, we are a footprint of what actually it makes downtown work. So when we actually do put these COVID policies that students are not on campus, that affects downtown revenue. It affects the whole Georgia State revenue, affects the police, affects everything. And so we gotta kind of look at it back, go back and look at what's going on here. Just thinking about it in a larger piece about our just basic relationships with the police. And, one thing that we have a strong issue with is our large homeless population that is downtown Atlanta. And why they're downtown? Because we have lots of generous people that are business people and community people that love to come downtown and to actually help and also give services and also give free food and so forth. That's why people come downtown, because they found a place like that. But those people are people of color. They are Black people. They are Latino people. And these are people that have also have not been heard of just being able to sit in the park. You know what I mean? It's very interesting. Like, I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. Like, if I've never heard of an ordinance, you can't sit in the park late at night. I mean, they'll think they'll have a riot up there. But down here, there's certain city ordinances that say you can't sit in the park after 7, you have to move things around and all. So all these things about police and relationships is a very city conversation that needs to be had. And I think when we hear the word of defund the police, that came up, it's like, wow, here are people for many years have been sitting around saying, let's try civilian review boards, let's try working together, let's do PAL leagues, let's do all these things. And folks, now with the age of social media, when we didn't have video as evidence, we now have video as evidence over the last 10 to 15 years and saying this is not working, it's not enough. Let's look at defund police, because you know what? What the police department actually represents is one of the last bastions of white male privilege. And so what people are actually running around saying is like, you know what? This system is not working. Let's look at it. And clearly, let's be clear, is that defund the police, it's nothing new. Let's be really clear about that. This has been talked about. Zero-based budgeting has been talked about in the governments in Reagan, and also Jimmy Carter here in the local area have talked about ways to how do you look at a department and see what it's actually doing and defend its budget every year. Usually in city budgets, which I've been a part of, is that, what do? You ask for another 3% increase. You ask for another 5% increase, and you have these kind of huge things. And you're like, well, what do they actually do? And so when we have this conversation about looking at what the police department actually does and who they're here to protect and so forth, let's have this conversation and really look at what does policing actually mean 2020 in the downtown area of Atlanta.
But, I think the term defund the police, I don't think it's the correct term for what I have in mind. I want to reimagine policing in America, because when you reimagine policing, you can do things like I did. I started a homeless outreach and proactive engagement team with 6 officers and a sergeant. It has nothing to do with policing, but they're there to help the homeless that are in our footprint. So it helps Georgia State University. And, they have relationships with about 32 different organizations downtown. And so that's part of what I see as reimagining policing, is putting more of our resources towards social services, towards mental health illness, towards crisis intervention training. I'm one of the only agencies in Georgia that 100% of my police officers are crisis intervention trained. And that's training that's a week-long training on how to deal with people in crisis who are having a mental health illness, mental health breakdown, or alcohol or drug overdose, things like that. And so it's important for me for them to be certified in that. And so when you start looking at taking resources and moving them from the normal policing, kick the door down warrants, I don't allow no-knock warrants. They've always been ridiculous. And so they're specifically banned in my policies. Specifically banned in my policies are chokeholds. We specifically went through all of my policies since May 25th, and we said, how can we do better? And how can we reimagine the Georgia State University Police Department so we don't have a Breonna Taylor, so we don't have a George Floyd? And the way you do that is to put resources in places where you're having problems. Do we have a homeless problem downtown? Yes. A lot of them have mental health issues and they're mentally ill. They're very difficult to deal with. I'm actually looking at trying to hire a couple of clinical psychologists and put a clinical response team together where one of my CIT certified officers in plain clothes would be with a clinician to respond to those mental health calls. And we're not the guy who's going to put handcuffs on you and going to put you in the back of a police car to take you to Grady for them to evaluate you. We would take a different approach and have a clinician out there who can 1013 someone who needs to go to the hospital. And so when you say defund the police, it's a little bit for me, I don't think it would be healthy. And we have seen in communities that have defunded or even proposed defunding, the morale of the police department goes down and violent crime goes up. And we see it all over the country. And so we have to be real careful. I do think the policing in America needs to be reimagined. And I'm on board with doing whatever we need to do to reimagine that so people aren't afraid of being pulled over by the police. So these generational stories that you speak of, you don't have those interactions with the police.
Downtown, there are many different police officers wearing many different kind of colors. I mean, you can have a state police, and then there's Georgia State Police, and there's Atlanta Police, then there's Fulton County Police. And so as someone like me, I see police. I know you're trying to make the good move with the GSU police, yeah. But I see downtown. I see some in green uniforms. I'm like, are we in Beirut? I have no idea what's going on. I see some in blue outfits. I see some in white. So for us, it's like we're sitting back like we are being over-policed downtown with all these different tribes of police that I know that we're working closely with you, but there are 5 and 7 other departments that are also out there that are also the problem and are not coming to the table to have these discussions. That is really, if you get pulled over downtown, it could be a Georgia State patrol officer pulling, not Georgia State University, but Georgia State. And so these are very, it's the discussion about who's downtown and who oversees what, because I'm confused about that.
Well, we have these discussions all the time, so I can be running the perfect police department, and everything's going wonderful. The community loves us. Georgia State loves us. We're doing the best job we can. And then some police chief in Ferguson, Missouri, where the racial balance of the department is completely skewed with the community they police. I'm doing everything right. They're doing everything wrong. And so we've been meeting as chiefs, me, Atlanta, Fulton County. So we have a new sheriff coming into Fulton County, Pat Labatt, who used to run Atlanta Corrections. We've been talking about how we can make changes. The new MARTA police chief, Scott Crayer, is on board.
Another one, MARTA.
The new MARTA is on board to make changes. The men in green, they're the Federal Protective Services because we have the federal building downtown. So you do have different agencies downtown, but the primary responsibility for downtown is the city of Atlanta, and Georgia State University has primary on all our buildings and secondary within about a quarter mile from our buildings. And so you will see a lot of us. And I think that's good for the university because our response time is so quick. Atlanta has issues with some right now with response time. And so we get there and try to quell situations quickly. And then when you talk about infrastructure, and I'm glad you brought that up because when I got here, the camera systems weren't working. Some of the card readers weren't working. They hadn't done an audit on the Panther card system in 10 years. I had an audit done on all of that. We found cards that had all access cards for people that had been deceased for several years. We had cameras down. We spent about $2.5 million over the last couple of years redoing the entire system and putting it under the police department so it can be properly managed, our surveillance system. And so we've invested a lot of money in that infrastructure to do exactly what you need, what you said. We can see our campus from somewhere and not have to look like we're an occupying force, which sometimes can happen if you have Georgia State, you have Marty, you have Atlanta, and you see all these police cars everywhere. And my people may be pulling people over downtown. I have a traffic unit and issuing them warnings so they don't get so, angry or feel like they've been over-policed. But I don't control what Atlanta does. So I have to approach the Atlanta chief and say, hey, can we talk about the training that we're doing and train together and patrol together and figure out, because if something happens with the Atlanta Police Department, like college kids getting tased, or Rashard Brooks, or if something happens with Atlanta, it affects us because, as you said, you don't see what agency we are, you just see this uniform. And so we're all lumped into the same. So if one agency is bad in the entire country, then we're all seen as bad. So, we're the only agency in Georgia that has all three certifications from CALEA, ICLEA, and the state. Only 4% of Georgia police departments have CALEA certification, 4%. And that's 600 standards that you have to meet. But only 4%? That's ridiculous. To me, I think that the governor's office needs to take a more active role in saying, no, all of our police departments will be state certified. And I think the GACP has approached the governor, Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police, has approached the governor's office and asked him to sign on with GACP, who provides that state certification. So at least we're making the minimum standards. That we teach less than lethal force options, that we have less than lethal force things on our equipment belt, like tasers and things that you can use where you don't have to use lethal force against somebody. And so those are the things we want to push statewide. But like you say, I'm one organization, and we have in Georgia some organizations that have 2 or 3 people, 1 police chief and 2 officers, and they're very small and they don't have big budgets, so they can't afford body cameras. We didn't have body cameras when I came here to Georgia State. I implemented body cameras. I implemented tasers. So I've implemented a lot of things to make Georgia State a safer police department for our community. And now we've gotten into more de-escalation training. I just bought about a $180,000 trainer to train de-escalation and use of less than lethal force. It's also a use of force simulator where we can do active use of force, where we're going to start training that de-escalation. And we're also going a little step further. We're teaching not only de-escalation, but disengagement. Sometimes when the situation gets out of control, you have to have something in your head that says, just disengage, let this guy go about his business, and we'll pick him up tomorrow on a warrant. So we don't have to fight him in the middle of the street, possibly hurting him, possibly getting hurt. So we're exploring these options, but I think you're right. If all departments aren't exploring these options, it's a no-win situation for a police department that is doing everything right.
Chief, I want to come back to some of those specific things you just referred to, but first I want to ask Aliyah. So we've got maybe a model police chief here. If we take him at his word, and I am so far at least. These all sound really good, and I think they sound good to you. Given both that problem, the complexity of all these different agencies, and the police officers that a sophomore or a junior at Georgia State University encounters is most likely going to be APD, unless it is just to get in a building or something,
Actually, it's most likely to be GSUPD. Okay. Yes, because our footprint, we are so well patrolled that Atlanta just stays away from it. Okay. Right. And so pretty much if you get stopped on the GSU footprint, it's probably going to be a GSU PD officer because we are better staffed than APD. And so the APD Zone 5 commander just kind of leaves that to us, and we'll call them in if we have some issue that's outside of our jurisdiction or that we can't handle. Like, we do not handle homicides in the city. They handle homicides in the city. So we had a shooting the other day not too long ago over on Edgewood, and I think a 16-year-old was hit and killed, and it was off campus, but it was close enough to make me nervous. But Atlanta had to handle that, and so I think when you talk about defunding, let's say Georgia State University PD goes away, then primary jurisdiction for the school becomes an Atlanta police issue. So if the Atlanta Police Department is not doing everything I'm trying to do to be ambassadors to the students, then you have a lose-lose situation where you defund GSU PD and APD has to take up that slack, and now you're patrolled by Atlanta police officers who might not have your best interest at heart like we do.
But I just want to jump in. It's like, we sit here and see, you go downtown, you see these 7 or 8 different police officers and and then you're like, well, do they all need to be monitoring and surveilling me? I mean, I think this discussion is that we have a lot of money and resources that are actually been put into policing. So let's look at all the budgets, let's put them all up there, all right? And let's be able to start to divert. I think that's what the activists are talking about. Here are 7 different departments at police, all right? Let's look how they overlap each other and so forth. Is it actually necessary? And that's the discussion. Let's call it the zero-based budget discussion, which has happened in Georgia government before, and let's see who doesn't belong. If GSU police is doing 8 out of 10 and the other one's 3 out of 4, 3 out of 10, let's get rid of the 3 out of 10.
In terms of, because it's part of that same issue though, is there a way, Georgia's saying that as long as there's all these multiple departments overlapping each other, that essentially that this problem can't be sorted out, that as long as there's all the complexity of all these different departments. But what I was wondering from you is is there a way that the police chief, because most universities, big universities, have a police department or some sort of a function like this. Is it possible that undergraduate students at a place like Georgia State could kind of figure it out and get the message that, okay, these guys, that our cops are different from the other cops, and that the sorts of things he's talking about, would count, if that makes sense, and the reason I ask that is because I sort of doubt it a little bit. It strikes me as that's a really tall hill to climb. That just from my conversations with students is that it's going to take a lot of convincing and persuasion for them to see that there's something different about this one force. But what do you think about that?
So my perspective is in the Malcolm X grassroots movement's stance around policing. It's usually looked at like at neighborhoods. Like as you as a neighbor, you need to be policing your own community. Well, not necessarily policing it, but like de-escalating, handling issues if they arise. So I always look at it from like a neighborhood perspective. I never really thought about it at GSU's campus. So I think even with that, we have to look at it. Are we going to have our GSU PD not have the opportunities to abuse power? Have opportunities to hurt a student, things like that. And that's when we get into like defunding the police. And then when you're saying defunding the police, I feel like we're saying the same thing. You're just saying like, oh yeah, it would just be under the police, but it could be for mediation like services or anything like that. And we're like, we're saying move money there either way, right? And I think it should also maybe work with the police, not necessarily be under the police either. So this, we're looking at like, we're seeing like, oh yeah, get like a mediation team, like they would be independent, but you're asking for the same thing anyway. So it's like, might as well just move that money to start
basically, if we look at like counseling services, so we have counseling services on campus for students, and we work with counseling. I meet with them every week. Every Friday, we have a student of concern meeting, and we talk about students that may be having some issues and how we can deal with it as a community. And Dean of Students is in the meeting, counseling centers in the meeting. Our counselors do not come out to site. So what I want is counselors that come out to site. And so the only way I can get that would be either they be employees of the police department, or we reimagine the way that we do counseling. And so, and I think that I want to bring up another issue about the various police departments. You have to also not look at just budgets, but functions. And so the people in the brown suits you see are sheriffs. They're Fulton County sheriffs. They run the courts and the jails. They don't police or patrol the city of Atlanta. You'll see them in the city of Atlanta, but their function is not to patrol the city of Atlanta. Federal Protective Services, you'll see them walking around the city of Atlanta. Their function is building security at the federal buildings that are in Atlanta. That's their function. They don't patrol the streets of Atlanta. Atlanta. They don't go on calls for service. Neither does the sheriff's department. And Fulton County Police don't police in Atlanta at all. They have responsibility for a few buildings like 10 Park Place where our health care services for Grady is. They also have Department of Public Health, Fulton County's public health there. So you'll see them there, but they don't answer calls for service. The only agencies that answer calls for service at Georgia State University is Georgia State Ph.D., and we are the primary call taker for anything in and around our university. We have our own call center. Everything from 911 calls through APD gets routed to us. And then the secondary people that handle those calls here at Georgia State would be APD. So the chances of you having an altercation or interaction with a Fulton County sheriff or a MARTA police officer, either not in a MARTA station and not on a MARTA train or not on a MARTA bus, are basically zil, because they don't come outside of their jurisdiction and patrol or answer calls for service. And so
I think you might say that, but I think there are some students and other people that would beg differently.
That's not their function, let me say it that way.
Okay.
What do you mean by that exactly, George?
I mean, I bet there are many people out there that do believe that there are several that have overstepped their boundaries. And, and for us, I mean, he just gave us a playing card of what these colored, I have no idea what all those people, I don't know if Aliyah, did you know all those? And so that's another thing that should also be part out is about who's doing what and what color means what and all these other things, because we just don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting too when you mention the sheriffs and that they mostly run the correction system, the deputies and the sheriff. Oftentimes when I'm out talking about issues related to these sorts of things or race in America, people will ask me, well, what should I do? I'm talking about history, and they'll say, well, what can we do to change things today? And one of my first answers always is, do you know who the sheriff is? And they never do. People never know who their sheriff is. And then I'll say, well, you need to know who the sheriff is, and you need to participate in the election. And there's a long history in America, actually, of citizens getting mad about some dimension of law enforcement, and particularly with sheriffs, who are almost always elected, going out and getting involved in those elections. And in particular, these days, sheriffs are the people most responsible for what incarceration looks like and how that works. And so electing people to be sheriff who share some of these citizen concerns about mass incarceration and treatment of people is a small but really important first step, because we can't unelect Chief Spillane, but you could unelect a sheriff.
Well, and we just had a sheriff's election, and we had a new sheriff elected in DeKalb County, Melody Maddox, and a new sheriff elected in Fulton County, Pat Labatt, who used to run corrections with Atlanta. Both are very progressive, so I'm looking forward to some very progressive things coming out of both DeKalb County and the Fulton County Sheriff's Department. And I've met with both of them, and they're progressive people who really want to make some changes. And when you bring up the correction side of the house, I think a lot of this focus is on the police department, who enforce laws. But we're not looking at the silly laws that we have, where we put 1.6 million people in jail a year for minor possession of drugs. It impacts minority communities greater than it does other communities. We have to have these discussions about how are we going to reimagine the correctional system in the United States, where we put more people in jail or prison than any other industrialized nation. We've got to look at that, because you take that man or woman off the street, away from their family, they're not making any money, they're not paying taxes. We've got to look at it as a whole system, not just the police. We're the ones on the front line. We're the tip of the spear. But behind us, you've got to look at the for-profit prisons. You've got to look at the probation system, where they get put on probation and pay $44 a month for nothing and go in there once a month and all of these fees, and these are for-profit organizations doing probation in Georgia. So we really got to look at all that in addition to reforming, defunding, reimagining police, whatever we want to call it. I think that's necessary. But we've got to be able to have these frank conversations about the history of policing in America. I read your book, Slavery by Another Name. It was a very good book, and it was eye-opening. I never knew that those things happened between the Civil War, Reconstruction, and World War II. I didn't know that until I read the book. But we have to have people educate themselves. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in America, at least, we notice that when we start bringing up race, people want to put their heads in the sand and not discuss how we got to where we are. And as a police chief, my responsibility is to discuss how we got where we are and to how can we get to where we want to be. where we don't have these issues. We will always have, if we have police, if we have laws, we'll always have people who will break them. We'll always have people who will try to injure other people with knives or guns, and we'll always have interactions, negative interactions, because it's not a positive interaction when somebody shoots at you and you shoot back. It's a terrible interaction, and it's terrible for the officer involved as well. I don't think that people really understand that, but officers who are involved in a fatal shooting, about 80% of them will not be in this field in 5 years statistically. So we've got to look at all that. But the tip of the spear is the police departments, and I'm working on that from my little section of the world. I meet with the Atlanta chief, I meet with Fulton County, with DeKalb County, with MARTA. We're doing something joint with MARTA now to try to help each other out. And I think that's necessary, but we need to all be on the same page. We need to all be CALEA accredited, so we're all working by the same standards, the same use of force training, the same use of force standards. So it's a tough battle, but we've got to take it on.
Right. But for me personally, I mean, I'm from Boston, Massachusetts, and it's interesting. For my 40 years, I've in Boston and with police officers, I really have never had any experiences. But it's very interesting as a 6'5", 300-pound black male walking downtown, who I live downtown as well. It's just very interesting how many times I've been stopped and asked questions, and I'm like, I've never, here I am from Boston coming to Atlanta, the Black Mecca, experiencing, and I'm like, what is going on here? So it's really interesting about, as you look at deployments, you might say there might be, I don't know, I'm not in this, but there might be 10 police officers that might be in a certain square mile of Buckhead, and there might be 50 that are downtown. So you have 50 officers that are on the same unit. Of course, they're going to be looking a little bit more if it's a black area to see who's doing what or whatever, compared to 10 that is up in Buckhead who have the same amount of square footage, square area, so forth, or people that they've managed. But if you have 50 officers in one area, of course they're going to start finding ways to ticket, the more ticket people of color, to find ways to stop people for traffic violations and all these other things. And so the deployment discussion and the numbers is also a discussion that needs to be really had.
Well, go ahead, Leah.
Okay. Yeah, I really think people are just focusing on the police right now, but it's like they're prejudiced because they're enforcing prejudice laws. You know what I'm saying? At a point, we have to look at that too. I know the federal government just released the Justice and Policing Act, but the thing is, it's like you're not addressing any of the laws that y'all have out here. You know what I'm saying? That's making police, you know what I'm saying, where it encourages this type of behavior. So I definitely agree with you on that, but I also want to say is, even like how you're like, well, we're gonna have some progressive people come in. I'm speaking with Atlanta PD. The issue is this is a question about culture. Mm-hmm. Everyone's not gonna sit there and read slavery by another name. So.
Right. I think you're right about that, and I can tell you that, I'll give you a quick example. Last year, the city council was considering an ordinance to make possession of marijuana less than an ounce city ordinance violation. It's a $75 fine. I was the only police chief there that got up there and spoke in support of making possession of marijuana less than an ounce. It should be decriminalized, period, but it's a step in the right direction. Because for me, I don't feel like I should be putting students in jail for possession of marijuana less than an ounce. It's a waste of my resources, it's a waste of my time. There's a chance for a negative encounter and all of those things. And so I spoke, and some of the other people who saw me on TV say, you're the one trying to, decriminalize marijuana. I said, look, people who are arrested for minor drug violations, they lose their job because they can't make bond sometimes. They get out, they don't have a job now, they've got to rebuild their lives. It's a silly law, and we have to look at the system, not just the police departments, which do need, you're right, there's a culture there that needs changing. And there's a lot of us in policing that want to change that culture. And there's more than you would think. But sometimes they're in political positions. Like you said, you can't unvote me, but President Becker could fire me tomorrow if he doesn't like the way that I'm moving the police department at the university. The same thing with the city of Atlanta. If the city of Atlanta mayor does not like the job the police chief's doing, then he or she could be terminated at will. And so a lot of people are afraid to go out there on a limb and get on a TV like this and say, let's change some things. And we get criticized if you're trying to change things. I think it's a difficult position to be in, but for me, I think it's necessary to have this conversation. You mentioned, well, we talked about Watts, we talked about Rodney King. Nothing changed after Rodney King. We had some riots, we had some broken windows, we had some looting, and then everything went back to normal. Policing didn't change after Rodney King. And it hasn't changed. It's just now, I think, changing some after the most recent things that have happened, the Breonna Taylors, and you're seeing police officers indicted for criminal acts now more than you never saw a police officer indicted for a criminal act 10 years ago. They may have been fired for policy violation, but now you're seeing indictments for murder in some cases, and for all of those things. So we're seeing a change in the system. We're seeing police officers wake up. You mentioned that it was kind of one of the last bastions of white supremacy, white male supremacy. And what we're doing, though, like my department's 82% non-white. So I'm an 82% non-white department. City of Atlanta department is about mixed with the community. Their racial makeup is about the same as the community. That's how it should be throughout the country, because that's how you have a diverse police force that looks diverse, that every student can look and see. We have more women on Georgia State University's police department than any police department.
But also, I mean, the culture is that here are, you might have officers that are Black and that are women that do support white male supremacy in the form of a police department and laws and all those other things and so forth. So that's a very interesting discussion as well. But also, 50,000 people. That's a small town, and that's what Georgia State.
Right.
It's 50,000 student population, and also with staff and students. I'm not saying defund the GSU police, but you got to realize that's a community. 50,000 students, staff, faculty, all those other things. That's a lot of people that need. And and we're not. Georgia State is not a traditional campus, enclosed, all these other things. We're downtown. We also have 6 or 7. Is it, how many are?
Yes, there's 6 total. And so we do have campuses, in many places, Newton County, Decatur, Clarkston, Alpharetta. So we do have a big campus and 53,000 students, but we have a much bigger population that we actually patrol, because we have all of the private housing that is within our footprint, all the homeless or other individuals that are downtown. And then when we have conventions and visitors, we have a lot of them that are right there on the edge of our campus.
But if you go back in time in a place like Atlanta, if you go back to the 1920s, when it's an all-white police force, and not just the police, the whole local government, county and city, is just riddled with Ku Klux Klan, where basically you can't get a job at the city unless you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And there's a city council person, totally different kind of power distribution structure, but there's really a member of the city council who's the most powerful person over the police department. What now you'd call the public safety chair of the city council is really who runs it. And he's a big time Ku Klux Klansman, and he's the one who says, no, you can't get a job unless you join the Klan. And so you go from, and that fits with our perceptions, our assumptions of, hey, there's something racist about policing. That history fits with that. But then now here we are in the same place, and if we hear the story in Atlanta of a young African-American man who's in prison serving a ridiculous amount of time on an overcharged offense of some sort, there's a pretty good chance that he was arrested by a Black police officer, prosecuted by a Black prosecutor, judged by a Black judge, and taken down to the penitentiary by a Black sheriff. So we have this legacy of a racist system that did treat people very, very differently, deliberately treated people very differently. Today tries, at least on the surface, on paper, says it's not going to treat people differently, but there is this legacy. But now it's one that is implemented oftentimes by African Americans. And I think that's just one of the really complicated ironies of the whole thing. So it sort of gets to, can a Black police officer be being racist when he is mistreating a Black citizen?
Like we see even with the Policing and Justice Act, we're seeing like, oh, they're going to ban the chokeholds nationwide, but it's like we seen with Eric Garner, it didn't matter because it's a culture. So even though we're going to put in these new laws and new things on police, like I even seen, it was like, well, we won't give them, basically talking about defunding at that point, or reallocate, whatever you want to call it. They were really talking about defunding. But they're like, oh, if they don't do, what's it called, give us the data of how many like arrests they did or if there was like improper behavior. Well, I'm like, you're dealing for culture. They could be like, don't put that on there. They're going to mess up our money. So that's what we have to think of, like, what position we put in police. And they're like, why would I report that? It's going to mess up my money.
And you see
so,
Eric
right.
Gardner. I watched him on that whole thing go down, and I said, that's me. That is me, of someone that's being tired of being harassed by a police officer just walking down the street and just, and you're just sitting back and saying, this is actually me. And so when you hear people and families say, defund the police, that is the last thing to do, is you get them with the tax dollar right in the pocket.
Right.
All right? You get them, that's when the conversation starts to start with activists, when you hit people in the pocket.
Right. And that's our form of control. Because a lot of the GSU, PD, or PD just in general, it comes from tax, majority of it's coming from tax money. Then if it's not, there's even a concern around if it's coming from federal, okay, what's federal, like with anything, government gets in, the feds get in, and it's not like personable anymore. It's like, oh, you gotta arrest this amount of people, or you gotta write this amount of tickets. So we know that you're being productive rather than, oh, I helped somebody today. And that's how it needs to be like my quote, like I actually helped people. Period.
What do you say to that, Chief? Because that is a really common view. People really do believe that the police officers are often effectively under orders to write a lot of tickets, and that was the case in Ferguson, Missouri. That's what the Department of Justice found. But how real is that in your experience?
Well, in my department, it has no basis. In fact, I don't have a quota system. I don't require traffic tickets. I prefer they not write traffic tickets. I prefer that if they want to give a little bit of a lecture and explain why they're stopping them for right turn in the crosswalk, do that. I prefer we don't make arrests for minor violations. I prefer we mediate things. I prefer we go to the student code of conduct. However, in my tenure as a police chief, as I came up through Atlanta, when I was a young officer, I had a quota. I better write 5 traffic tickets a day, or I might lose my beat car. And so the culture that you talk about, that's hard to break, because people get in positions of power over years to be a sergeant, a lieutenant, a deputy chief, and that culture that they learned when they were a young officer is still with them as they grow. And so when you start talking about things like quotas, like traffic stops, are very dangerous for police officers in any case. But the more you make, the more danger you put yourself into of becoming involved in something. And the other thing with changing the culture is it's got to happen. I mean, more than just one department. I can't run the best police department in the country, and then right next to me have where you walk right off campus and get jacked up by APD for walking on campus. I think, though, that we all can look at the laws in this country and know that minority communities are over-policed. Definitely over-policed. The Red Dog, you mentioned Red Dog. That was, started by Eldrin Bell, a former police chief, at the height of the crack epidemic, to get the dope boys off the corner. And they rode 4 deep, and they got out and threw everybody on the ground and searched them. And they were, when George Turner became the chief, and I was one of his assistants, his deputy chief, we talked about that. And Red Dog was disbanded, but it did a lot of damage to community relations with the city of Atlanta. People who live in the community. So when I lived in Southeast Atlanta, my neighbor, I was doing a paper on this old jail, the old prison farm, and he had been there. He's older black guy. He said, they used to put me in that jail all the time for spitting on the sidewalk or crossing without a crosswalk, that kind of thing. So I think over-policing is something we have to address as well, and that's mostly in municipal police departments that type of behavior happens, where they're over-policed, particularly communities of color. I think that there should be, we talk about community policing all the time, but nobody ever really does it because it's hard. And it requires buy-in from the community, and it requires buy-in from the police. And so it's really difficult to do that. But we have to have those conversations. We have to have these conversations. And I'm going to keep having them until I get run off or we make some changes. I do think, though, that we also have to look at, when we talk about policing in America has some racist historic roots to it, right? But also we can all agree that murder's not something that we want to take off the books, or rape or robbery or car theft, so all of those things somebody has to make that case and bring it for prosecution. The cases like spitting on the sidewalk, the cases that we would call harassment if we got stopped. If I got stopped for crossing not at a crosswalk, jaywalking or whatever, I would call that harassment. We can look at those. We need to take a look at those laws that are in place for. In your book, even you mentioned loitering. I think was a law where they put people in prison because they couldn't pay the fines back then. And I think we need to look at these laws that put people in jail and hold them there because they can't pay fines or they can't pay probation or they can't make bond. And we need to get rid of them. Every time we have a problem, the politicians want to create a new law. I don't need a law to ban chokeholds. I can do it myself. And we have a duty to intervene that we started with our department, where you have to intervene if you see somebody doing something wrong, or I'm going to punish you with the same. If the officer did whatever he did, if it's a termination offense, you're getting terminated if you didn't stop it. But we have to have other police departments join in.
But it's interesting in the city of Atlanta. It's very interesting in parks. It's very interesting. There are some parks where dogs have more have places to sit, be it places to go, and have more rights than people. And so it's really interesting. How we look at this is that dogs, you can sit, bring the dog over there and all that, but here, people actually get, harassed or are told to move by loitering in certain parks in certain parts of the city.
Well, the city ordinance on parks, they're closed at 11 p.m. and they open back up at 6 a.m. So you can't be in a public park 11 to 6. And that came from a history of people using the park for illicit purposes in various parks in Atlanta and doing things in the park that they probably shouldn't have been doing. And those laws also, like when you start talking about not putting non-porous materials on the grass, that came from an Occupy protest where they set up tents. And we didn't have a law that we could put in. We didn't have a law that says you can't set up a tent in a park. It kills the grass. So they make a new law that says you can't put a non-porous item in the park. You can't lay down cardboard or plastic, that kind of thing, or put up a tent. So all those laws evolved because something happened where a politician said, well, let's solve it with a new law. And that's what they do.
How do you recommend that they solve those problems then? Because that's how we're seeing, like they're trying to address with laws. It's like if we see there's a homeless problem or there's people putting up tents, that's when we say reallocate police funding. Like, so we can maybe talk about housing, service programs to get them back into the employment. That's what we're seeing.
So really the question is, though, should you be reallocating police money? Why not reallocate money that goes to the arts? Why not reallocate money that goes to other, maybe reallocate traffic revenue to homeless issues? So why would it be that we want to reallocate police money? Now, I understand some police departments over-police, and maybe we don't need a large narcotics unit. Maybe, like we don't have Bearcats that crash indoors or military equipment. But maybe we need to look at that, at changing these departments. But the fact is that if you defund the majority of police departments, you will see a skyrocketing crime rate, murder rate. You'll just see that because we've seen it before. We've seen it in Baltimore when officers were indicted. Baltimore police shut down. Murder rate skyrocketed. In Atlanta this year, murder rates at 97 today, I think 98. Last year, they didn't have 80 the whole year. So we're seeing the result of police shutting down and being demoralized. And most police officers don't have to do this job. Some of us came to it to do good. Like you said, we wanted to do good. Most of us didn't come here to be the evil overseer of law. And I'd like to see changes, but I don't want to see us throw the baby away with the bathwater, they say, because the fact is that police are necessary and their functions are necessary to prevent very bad people. There are very bad people that you don't, that in this world there really are. Who is going to deal with those very bad people if we continue to defund the police?
Well, you got to think about the protests that just happened in May and June here in Atlanta. I live downtown. I've seen destruction of property. I've seen restaurants and storefronts been taken out of, rocks being thrown, and so forth. If someone wanted to do a protest, what are the policies or procedures that the police officers look for, or something in those kind of pieces?
So our policy, when I was with the City of Atlanta, and my policy still now, is anytime there's a peaceful protest, you facilitate it. If they want to march down Peachtree Street, you do the Frogger, you hop and you stop the traffic and let them march down Peachtree Street peacefully. When it becomes non-peaceful, when they're breaking out windows here at the Rialto, we lost $40,000 worth of windows on a Friday night at the Rialto at Haas Howell at Adderhold, and so 40,000 worth of windows lost. So when people become that's not a peaceful protest, and so I think there's a line that needs to be drawn. People should be allowed to peacefully protest. They shouldn't be constricted to a certain area in an obscure part of town where you can protest on Liberty Plaza, but nowhere else. They should be able to march in the street because the people should be heard. So my philosophy has always been, when I was running the field operations for Atlanta and out there at all of the protests during Ferguson, my policy was we have people in riot gear, but you don't see them. They're on buses waiting to be called in case it becomes not peaceful. But don't automatically presume it's going to be not peaceful and bring in riot people right away. Walk with them, talk to them, try to get their cooperation to be on the sidewalk if it's a small group. Stop the traffic for them. As long as they don't go on the interstate, that's very dangerous. We could all agree. But if they're taking a street and inconveniencing the traffic flow, just handle it. Bring your motorcycle unit out. Move the traffic off the street, let them go on the protest. And that's mostly why Ferguson stayed peaceful, because we didn't stop them from marching in the street. We stopped them from getting on the interstate because obviously it's a very dangerous situation out there on the interstate for pedestrians. Right. But we didn't stop them.
But Doug, who calls in the National Guard? I mean, you know, I don't know how those conversations go. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that does get you into another realm of all this, and the politicization of those sorts of decisions and other decisions, where if the governor decides, when the governor calls in the National Guard, mobilizes the National Guard, is that now they may well do it on the basis of a request from the city of Atlanta or the mayor of Atlanta, but then you have, as we've had in the past year, you have the president talk about, I want to send in the National Guard, or I want to send in active military, you know. So these sorts of things that once seemed to be relatively clean responsibility areas have gotten all mixed up.
Well, in a normal situation, the National Guard would be called in by the mayor of the city. In the situation where they were called in during these past demonstrations, they were called in due to damage at state-owned property, the GSP buildings and other state-owned property, which is where they had them sitting. They didn't have them on our campus patrolling any part of the city. They were called in. But as you say, did we need to have them? Did we need to have the big Army trucks and the soldiers, in our civilian world? That's a good question.
But it seems like there's a couple of core things that come up over and over again, and that have to do with trust and this relationship between the citizens and the police, or whoever is going to do, whether we're calling them the police or whether we're calling them human crisis officers, but the people who. It's always been the case in human civilization that there's been a social contract of some sort where there's the group, and the group selects some people from within the group who are going to go patrol the perimeter, you know, but probably before there was language, there was some arrangement like that. Who's watching out for danger that might come get us? And in that, there was always a kind of a deal made, you know, that said, okay, those people are going to also have power to do things that the rest of us don't want to do, or that could get out of hand, but we got to have confidence in them that they're not going to abuse that power, you know. And that's the thing. Police officers do have powers that we've given them, you know, as citizens, to do things that the rest of us probably, couldn't do or don't want to do, but that we acknowledge some necessity to some part of it. But then what we've got now, what we've arrived at, is that deal has broken. You know, that trust is broken because the citizens have lost a lot of confidence in whether the police can be trusted with that. And part of that has just come, it seems, from cell phones. You know, just a few years ago, if you'd asked me about these sorts of things, I would have said, I think I did say in some conversations to people, no, if there's an incident of a police officer just shooting a guy in the back as he's running away, I would have been incredibly skeptical. You know, I would have said, unless that's like a mobbed up cop who's being paid to do that or something. I just would have said, you know, a regular cop's not going to do that out of just anger or pride. But now you see situations, and we see it on video, and you realize that, okay, this guy's just really mad. You know, he's furious.
The evidence.
Yeah, and now we can see it, and you realize, okay, stuff has been going on that we didn't, you know, we really didn't understand. But how do we get back to this place, you know, of where there's trust?
Well, there was a judge in Massachusetts that that ruled that it was okay for if a young black man was being pursued by a police officer, it was okay for them to run because you look at the data and the stats that he has more chance of getting killed and so forth. But also this whole issue regarding right to carry. Georgia State has now we can bring that into the discussion about people now feeling, you know what, I need to get my own arms to be comfortable and safe. And I know we, as a university, it's all over the gambit, as you know, on that as well. And I'd love to hear what you think about right to carry as well.
What do you, I mean, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah. So when I heard about right to carry, I was just like, well, I don't see a large GSUPD presence or APD presence. So I was like, at a point, they're saying, hey, we can't really protect y'all, so here goes the right to carry. That's how I interpret it. And I would think, fine. You know, a lot of that doesn't need to fall on the police department. And that's why I was going to ask you, like, at a point, it needs to be on civilians. I think that's when it goes to how do we build the trust. I think you have to give communities room to be like, what do y'all want to do? Rather than coming in policing like you're complaining about us. Or, you know, some of it is valid. What does this look like? And I even think how we're not, like how you said there's violent crimes in Atlanta. The way to address violent crimes is education, access to jobs. You know what I'm saying? What's the root problem? We're always just seeing, oh, get the police, create a new law, but it just never want to put any money towards it. And the reason why we keep talking about reallocating police funds, because I think it's called the Federal Research Reserve, something like that. But it shows like if you increase funding in police, it doesn't show a decrease in crime. You know, and we have like places like Chicago, $1 billion budgets, still have issues. Atlanta, quarter of the budget goes to police. I'm not sure how much of that goes to GSU, but I'm glad we're having this conversation to bring it up, you know, and we're still seeing that. So it's like we're not addressing it correctly. We keep addressing it, and I don't know, I think that goes into politics too. Let's put police out there to show we're doing something rather than making like changes that will be more quiet, where we're having like, okay, let's just make access to jobs more available. What type of issues are you dealing with on GSU? Are you getting called after the fact, after something already happened? Or
No, you know, we're really proactive. Okay. We have a Live Safe app where people can send us tips. We're very proactive with housing. We're very proactive with the Dean of Students. And so we try to take action to prevent things from happening. I'll give you an example. Last year, we had a student who was threatening suicide. He was not on campus, but GSU PD were able to get a warrant for his phone and ping it and send Ackworth police to a field up there by Lake Altoona, where they found him with a gun in his truck and took him into custody, and we got him the mental health help that he needed. That's the proactive stuff that we do, you know, almost every day. The reactive stuff would be 911 calls where you have a fight or you have a disagreement or you have those types of things. But mostly we're here to be ambassadors to our community, to answer questions. We answer a lot of questions on where Adderhole building is or, you know, lost students. We do a lot of that ambassador type work. I think the important thing to remember, though, if we ever did have an active shooter situation or if we ever did have a very dynamic situation, our people are well trained and equipped to handle that as well. I wanted to be ambassadors, but we also have the need because we're in an urban environment. And if GSU PD went away, then APD would be the responding unit. In an active shooter, you may have a 10-minute response time where you have a 1-minute response time now, and that can make a big difference in a serious situation. And then let's face it, if we defunded policing all across America and police went away, it would not solve the problem of redlining. It would not solve the problem of systemic racism that exists in banking. It wouldn't solve the problem of systemic racism that exists in corporations that promote. We had a CEO of a company that mentioned that he doesn't have a large minority minority population to pick from for those executive positions, right? Because he's not looking. But the fact is that we have CEOs of companies that believe that they can't find people of non-color for higher up positions in their corporation. They said the talent pool is too low. It's a ridiculous assumption, but an actual CEO of a company, I read it today, said that. I mean, and so if you took away all the police, you'd still have violence because people are violent. So we were always going to have violence, and we're always going to have some way to control the community. Yes, education's great. Education works great in preventing drug use too. We spend it all on enforcement. Spend it all, reallocate that money, and don't put people in jail for minor drug violations. Put more outreach in the community to talk about drugs and to talk about the ways, put more programs out there. But do that. But you can't take away the core responsibility of the police to solve homicides. You mentioned Chicago. Their homicide solvability in Chicago is about 25%. Atlanta's is 90%. 25% shows a great lack of confidence in the police department because people aren't willing to work with the police department. Here we have a little bit better situation, a lot better, I would say, than Chicago. I think Atlanta's has come a long ways. I think we've been at the forefront. We started implementing the 21st Century Policing document in 2015 in the Atlanta Police Department, looking at, and one of the tenets is building trust and legitimacy in the community. That's one of the tenets that came out of that paper, and we started that. So I think we're a little bit ahead of the game. We're still going to have situations, and if whenever you have people who have a little bit more power than the general public, as you say, we're going to have people who will resist that and will not participate in the system.
No, I got to say, with my 7 years being here, I didn't know, who was in charge of the police in 2013, 14, 15. But I got to give it up to you of being a more public person, going out to student group meetings, being able to have those things and having those discussions. It's been really refreshing to see so. But, it's interesting, as students at Georgia State University, as a graduate student, undergraduate, they give us this big, thick book called the Student Code of Conduct, and they said, you didn't read it, right? You read it, you get something in, and you get written up. Do we have the same thing for police on our campus? A police code of conduct, where we as students or our people in the community can be actually say, you know what? Violated page 7, page 3 on here, section B. So I think these are some of the things where there can be start of a conversation where, okay, we have a code of conduct. All right, well, we need to make sure that there's a code of conduct that the police actually adhere to. And this could be some of the upcoming discussions.
I think so. And I'll tell you, we have, because we're CALEA, ICLEA, and state certified, we have all these codes of conduct. They're called standard operating procedures, very lengthy, multiple SOPs. What we're actually considering about doing, because of transparency, we're looking at putting that on our website. So you can go in and look at use of force policy. What's the use of force policy at Georgia State University Police? We're also looking at putting links to body cameras on our website, where when we have arrests and use of force incidents, you can go in there and watch the body camera. And we want to be as transparent as we can when we have those incidents. I did a pool of use of force complaints for the last 3 years at Georgia State, and we had one. And it was a person that was arrested who complained that the officer put the handcuffs on too tight. So that's one. In all the interactions we've had in the past 3 years since I've been here, we've had one complaint. So I don't get a lot of citizen complaints about the actions of GSUPD. When I do, I take them very seriously. But I want to be more transparent, and I want to put our standard operating procedures out there to say, yeah, we do have a policy that prohibits chokeholds. We do have a policy that prohibits berating citizens, using profanity. There's all kinds of policies that we have. We probably have 700 different policies that are CALEA standards, which is supposed to be best practices in policing. And so we do have that, and we can make that available.
Before we run out of time, and I suspect the four of us could go for a couple more hours at this very easily, but there are a couple things I wanted to ask you about specifically. One is that, we talked about this notion of that historically the need for the public to trust the police and the kind of the deal that was involved in giving the police these powers because the rest of the group of the society trusts them. But there's also the flip side. The flip side is that the police are going to trust the public to to back them up, but also to to do their part in maintaining the security of the group. Where you're talking about transparency, letting people see the body cam footage really fast, giving people access to what exactly are these rules, what exactly happened to this one cop who had a complaint filed against him, an advisory board that doesn't exist just at the pleasure of the chief or of a mayor. Those are all things that empower citizens and give citizens power over the actions of police officers. Generally, most police officers I talk to, even ones who are friends of mine, they're really reluctant about that kind of stuff. They really don't want a citizen advisory board that could, because they basically they have lost faith in the public too, to understand, they sort of assume that if there's any complaint about us, all those citizen powers are going to be used against us. Mm-hmm. That's one reason why you end up with police unions that sort of take the position that no complaint can ever be legitimate. But so how do we, that's another, in the end, that's another dimension of police behavior and police attitudes. But how do you change that? How do you get cops to be more open to the idea that they should be scrutinized?
Well, that's a really hard thing to do with police officers and really with anybody. If you look at it, we lose more people to medical malpractice a year than we do automobile accidents, but doctors aren't wearing body cameras. And so, we're part of the government though. So we're the tip of the spear of the government. And so we have to act a certain way and act accordingly. And in my opinion, the way to do that is to have an open dialogue with citizens review boards. The fact is that anywhere in the country, if a citizen review board votes to fire an officer and an officer is fired, they would have appeal process. And the fact is that the Supreme Court and the higher courts have already ruled on when a police officer can use deadly force. And if that force was reasonable and necessary at the time, they will win the case ultimately. If you have a reasonable civilian review board that's trained in Title 17, Title 16, in the cases that we have, where I know we had one demand that said that they don't want police officers shooting at cars, period. Well, that's been up to the Georgia Supreme Court, and it was ruled that police officers, if someone in a car is driving at them, can use that amount of force. So it's already been through. It was a case that happened in the city of Atlanta, Allen versus the city of Atlanta, and he won that case at the Georgia Supreme Court. So there's already precedents where I can't make a rule that says you can't. I can say you can make every effort not to put yourself in the position where you have to shoot at a car, but I can't say you can't because it's already been through the Supreme Court, Georgia Supreme Court. And so there's a lot of things that people don't know about use of force policy that's really governed by Tennessee Gardner, by other use of force rulings in the United States that went all the way to the Supreme Court and said, no, a police officer can do that. The Supreme Court said that. And so once the Supreme Court rules on that, we can't make any kind of rule in a department that goes against the Supreme Court ruling because that issue's already been decided by the highest court in the United States. And so we do have several issues that people want the police not to do that we can't. The Supreme Court's already said that police can use deadly force in these situations. Now we can do more de-escalation training. We can do better weapons that are non-lethal weapons. We have a lot of issues in the country where people are shot and killed by police and they have a knife, let's say. We had something at Georgia Tech recently, last 2 years, where a kid had a little, some kind of Leatherman tool and was shot and killed by the police. But for me, when I saw that, I said, well, we got to make sure that our officers aren't put in that situation, that they have tasers and beanbag shotguns that can take someone out with less than lethal force where you don't have to shoot them with a handgun. So that's the thought process that I'm going through right now as a police chief, saying, what can we do to prevent these situations?
And then we see on TV a young white man with a gun running around, and the police not questioning him, but thanking him for his service. And so these are the kind of the dyads that African Americans see.
And I think this is a little bit skewed because the media will show that one picture of that white guy running around with a gun. They won't show the 10 other pictures where we disarmed successfully young black males that had guns. So there's stories that you can come up with that are outside the norm.
And then you also hear the voices of your grandparents and your great-grandparents telling you the stories of Tamar Rice, the real life story of Tamar Rice being, the real life stories of Eric Gardner. These are real, and these are passed down by our parents, and you know, and you have to, you know, and then these are echoes and voices are ahead that say when we see a police officer, stop. You need to move as fast as possible.
And we have to have these conversations. We had a great conversation with our football team, mostly African-American young men, and we talked frankly about them being stopped by police. They were complaining mostly about Atlanta police stopping them, but we tried to get with them and explain to them, you know, how to avoid those kinds of conflicts. But I think you're right. I think that as a black male, you have a different perspective of the police. As a woman of color, you have a different perspective of the police because you have those stories passed down. I don't get hassled by the police. You know, I'm a white male. I can walk around Atlanta, you know, all the time. Now, if I drive over to the Bluff and I drive around in a plain car, I'll get pulled over because what's the white guy doing in the Bluff? You're buying heroin, right? So in that case, you know, you kind of would get profiled. But for the most part, I'm not worried about that. And so we have to somehow figure out how we can come together and say, yeah, these are stories from the past. But then the problem is Tamir Rice is not long ago, you know, and I watched that video of the cop jumping out of the car and within 3 seconds he had shot that kid. To me, it's a murder that you don't drive up on. Tactically, first of all, as a defense tactics instructor, you don't drive up on someone you think is armed. You stop way away and let this person explain what they're doing. So there have been more recent mistakes, and those stories will be passed down to the next generation if we don't fix it. But we have to come together and fix it. And I don't have all the answers, but I'm telling you, I'm going to work as hard as I can for as long as I'm doing this to try to get the answers and to try to understand the perspective from a person of color that I've never been discriminated against because of the color of my skin that I know of. And I came up through a majority black department in Atlanta with supervisors that were black. I never felt discriminated against. I don't have that, but they do. The black males that I know that are friends with, they had that discrimination in their lives. Even the cops will tell you, when I'm not in this uniform, I have the same problem every other black male in America has. And so, you know, it's harder for me to understand it. I'm trying, you know, I'm trying to not be a dinosaur and evolve and try to understand where we are in this country. But the real issue is how do we fix it? And we could fix all the police department in the whole country, and it probably wouldn't help the plight of poor America much at all. So we got to figure out how to do that as a society.
Right, and that's, you know, that's the last, you know, any mother will tell you that's the last thing they want to hear at 1 o'clock in the morning is a police department calling that their son has been murdered. You know, so.
Well, and I agree with you. You know, when Russell Stallnaker with the Atlanta Police Department was murdered, I had to go pick up his mother. Nothing like a police car and your son is a police officer driving up at your house at 2 in the morning. And I had to knock on her door, and it was one of the hardest things I ever had to do. So I can imagine on the flip side, you know, as a policeman in Atlanta, I've been to 27 police funerals, 27 men that were murdered in the community by people in the community. And so I've seen the other side of it as well, how dangerous it can be out there. And so, you know, you see these relationships now where a guy running from the police that shoots and kills himself and people were rioting the next day. That doesn't make any sense because that's not, you know, that's not an action that the police officer took. I understand Minneapolis, I understand Ferguson. Tamir Rice bothered me a lot. Baltimore bothered me. So I see those situations. But in policing, you will see police respond to violence in a violent manner. There's no other way to respond to somebody shooting at you. Unarmed people bothers me. We have to look at those very closely. But we also have to look at what causes someone to want to what is going through their mind where this traffic stop is so important to them that they want to take a gun and risk their lives and risk the officer's life. We've got to look at that and have conversations about how we react to police officers that do stop us on the street, legitimately stop us on the street. And then there has to be a clear and transparent complaint process where if you feel like you're being stopped because of the color of your skin or you're being profiled, that's another reform that I'm doing. I put in a Guardian Tracker software system that is for bias-based policing that'll tell me at the end of the year how many black males we stopped, how many females, the whole thing. So I'll be doing, at the end of next year, I'll be doing a bias-based policing report to say, well, who are we policing at Georgia State? And what does that look like? And what are the actions that we took when we stopped that black male, that black female, that white male? What happened there? So we can do an evaluation of, are we targeting people because of the color of their skin or because of their actions? And so it's important that we look at all of that.
I get the sense out of all this, and then we've got to wrap this up. And any final thoughts from you guys? But I definitely get the sense that, on the one hand, that what the chief is talking about here, these really are exactly the sorts of things that we would hope that a well-intentioned police chief would be pursuing. And so it's really affirming in a way. You know, there's still sort of proof is in the pudding dimension. You know, where does all this go? And but it's all very affirming. But it is also remarkable to think about that, sort of where we started the very beginning of this conversation, that as much as people universally don't like violent demonstrations and don't like to see windows broken and don't like to see what's called rioting, that is what shook the situation up. You know, that, you know, it was this situation that developed in 2020 that for some reason was different from before. And it took a kind of citizens behaving beyond boundaries they'd behaved before, and some of it even probably illegal conduct. But it seems like it's that you were on the right track, but you're even more on the right track in a way now since all that.
Yeah, and I think what's happening is to justify this as a. I'll try to act like I'm black and I understand more than I do. Somebody wrote that, you know, can we go back to Dr. Martin Luther King's nonviolence? And one of my other friends said, well, they killed him too. So as a black person, I'm thinking, okay, we tried the nonviolent route, right? We tried that. And then we tried the violent route with the Black Panthers who, you know, were firebombed in Philadelphia. And we tried that. That didn't work. So how do we get America to say, look, we know, you know, we're having a problem here. And we need you as white Americans to wake up and say, let's solve this problem. And I think we just all have to get together as Americans and figure out just what it is. And like you said, not every white American is going to read Slavery by Another Name. It probably should be required reading, like, you know, in school, like like Huckleberry Finn is. And so those kinds of things probably should be required reading so we can see, as police officers also, why is this black man so nervous about me? I just want to talk to him about his taillight being out. Or for me, the situation in Minneapolis, that man was so paranoid and so worried about the police. You have to know that he's on some type of drug, that something else is going on with him. He says he has COVID. You know, that was probably a situation where you may not could have de-escalated it. You probably should have disengaged it and said, you know, it's not worth it to have to fight this man in the street. And the arresting officer that was charged with murder, I think, knew him because he worked with him at a nightclub. And that makes me even more like, well, why would you, you know, if you knew him, you knew that he doesn't normally act like this. So get someone out there that can provide the assistance that he needs. But we've got to wake up and realize that. Now, I'm not advocating that we allow people to spit on police officers, shoot at police officers, stab police officers, resist arrest, legal, legitimate arrest when you're driving under the influence of alcohol, or you're you know, violating some traffic law, driving 130 or whatever, where it's an arrestable offense. I'm not advocating that, but I am advocating looking at it at each situation and saying, you know, and I'm happy that as part of my policy is we have to ask our question. Everybody doesn't need to go to jail. And I worked on a pre-arrest diversion program with Atlanta. I'm also got to go to the White House and talk about that during the Obama administration. The pre-arrest diversion programs work for small offenses like prostitution or other offenses that those people probably shouldn't go to jail for that. Let's get them some help and some some guidance in life. And I think we talked about 10-year-olds or that were tearing up a garden somewhere, and these are kids, and we have to have at Promise Centers in Atlanta, which is what the foundation is doing. These great programs to help kids, provide that guidance, that instruction, and the education, as you said. I think none of us would argue that. If we didn't have poverty, if we had better education, we wouldn't have as many crimes, because people sometimes are driven to criminal activity because they don't see any other way to make money. And
the Black Panthers were not violent, by the way. They were just reacting to violence to them, and I think that was more the move movement, which was different. I just want to make sure that Philadelphia.
Well, I think we had an Atlanta police officer sitting in a van at Memorial and Boulevard that was shot in the head by a Black Panther Party member. So I would say some of them might have been a little violent, because we did have a police officer murdered by them.
I think
not all of them.
That goes into prisoners of war, depending on what the situation was.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
But if we bring it back to the present and really where we are, but Alana, give us a final thought about this. I mean, you seem like you've been encouraged in some ways by some of what you've heard?
So I think when we're talking about like getting the community involved, one of the biggest concerns I have, even like, because I get where you're saying like, we would let the court system go through that, like if we had like a control board or whatever. The thing is, as a Black person, the courts don't work for us. So I would recommend that if we're still revisioning policing, to give them that control and just see what happens. If it's like, if it comes into a policy thing, it is what it is. We'll challenge that later. So we have to make sure we're putting stuff, making people accountable, because to make sure they're not going to abuse their power. Then also another thing, like how you're saying, like I want to put this tracking system in place, that needs to be wide known by GSU to know, like we're not scared to hold ourselves accountable. And I think, we have to be those nonconformist leaders.
That's
and
part of our
GSU.
policy. I mean, part of our piece that we're going to get out there this year, and that's part of the promises that commitments I've made to the task force. And the task force had some bullet points in it on what we're advising to do, but I've made commitments on all of those that we will do these things. And we've already changed most of the policies to that. Now, an advisory board would be there for policy violations. Unfortunately, police officers don't have a chance to write a non-criminal ticket. If you commit battery, the charge is battery, and it goes to the criminal court system. That's another issue for Black America with the disparate sentencings that we see that has to be worked on. And so, unfortunately for me, I have no control. Once that ticket's written, it goes over to the courts. I have some discretion where I can't write it, but if I've got a female victim that has a black eye and I've got a male that punched her in the eye and I've got a video that showed it, I don't have any other means. I can't bring it before some tribunal to say, can we get him some anger management classes? It has to go into the court system. And unfortunately for him as a Black male, his sentencing may be a little stiffer than I would get for the same crime. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to work on that system as well. And we can jump through the whole criminal justice system if you want, from the fact that you can't sue a prosecutor for prosecuting you for something he should know that you're not guilty of. Right? And so the whole system has to be looked at. We're the tip of it, and from my little perspective here at Georgia State, I have connections with other agencies, and I'm trying to talk them into let's all get together and talk about these things and make sure that we're all on the same page and doing the right things.
Even hearing you hint, we do need to have other services. It's concerning when ADAC sent their letter to President Becker. We were like, hey, mediation teams, increased counsel service, and we're hearing you say the same thing, but we're not seeing those commitments. So I hope you can send
that's the good thing, is I have the
Right.
power to implement that, unless Dr. Becker fires me, but I have the power to implement changes in the police department to prohibit certain behaviors and to act a certain way and to discourage other behaviors. And I have the power to fire a police officer if he or she is not getting it. So that's a good thing. But when it comes outside of the police department, to the courts, to the correction system, to the judicial system, that's another whole conversation that has to be had about the disparities that exist in that system.
And even how you mentioned, like, people should read Slavery by Another Name. Even in our demand letter, we're like, you need to have curriculum around security. And I think they even go to, we need revision security. Like, that's a part of that. We even recommended it to go further, have, like, just a Black history course, period. Because as we see, everyone's around the world studying it now, where it's that important. Or that could be like, so I'm just looking at what you're saying, what we said, and it's just like, it just doesn't seem like a lot of thought wasn't put into it.
That's one of the things that came up from the task force for racial equality is required bias-based training for all university employees. And so we teach a class, it's an implicit bias class where we talk about that all of us have implicit biases, and it comes from our grandparents' stories and our interaction with the police and our interaction with each other. And we have to all realize that we have them and be able to control them to do our jobs properly. Well, it's the same thing with a professor or even a high school teacher. They also have implicit bias. And if you study even K-12, there's disparities in punishment with kids too, where minorities are punished at a higher rate than white kids. And so we got to fix all of this. It's not just a police problem. I'm going to do what I can. I'm going to do the best job I can until they run me out of here. And then I'll probably do something, I'll write a book or something.
Well, the one thing I'm certain of from all of this is that I believe you that you're going to do the best job that you can, and I believe that if it doesn't work, these guys are going to make sure that you or somebody else do an even better job. Sure. And I think that's maybe the most constructive thing out of all this is that, like you said, these are conversations that have to happen and have not been happening and are, in fact, crucial conversations like the title of this show. And I think we've had one of those today. We didn't arrive at the solution, because there is no the solution. I think that's the clearest thing of all. But I think we've heard a lot about some attitudes and some practices that maybe can change and maybe can make a difference. So thank you all for being part of this, and thanks to the audience. And we hope you'll join us in another month for our next crucial conversation.